a management major at Purdue University Calumet. I am a senior, and my faculty mentor is Dr. John Rowan, who is the Dean of the Honors College as well as Interim Dean for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. So I basically created a framework to help corporations integrate ethics. And so there's a little bit of preliminary information that I'm going to share with you first. So first off, it's important to understand who is a stakeholder. So for the purposes of my paper, a stakeholder includes all human interest holders, both direct and indirect, and whether at the individual or at the community level. It's also important to understand virtue ethics. And essentially that is concerned with the individual moral character. Virtues, they can be praised, they can be blamed. They are voluntary things. So, you can't blame somebody for something that they have no control over, essentially. So that's the differentiation with virtue. And so virtue falls in between excess and deficiency, where virtue is that balance in the middle. And they are habits, and they require practice, and they require nurture. It's also important to address how businesses are currently incorporating ethics into the corporation and why it's a problem. So this table right here shows a few different methods that they are currently using, things like a chief ethics and compliance officer, code of ethics or code of conduct, different workshops, different trainings, things like that. And so the problem with this is that it's using resources, and that in itself is not necessarily a problem, but it becomes problematic when the employees are not happy with the ethical resources that corporations are providing, and then these resources that they have, they're not promoting them. There's no point of it being there if they're not going to use it. So they're also not addressing the things that employees are regularly faced with, those gray areas. And then, more importantly, for the purpose of my paper, most of the resources, they're designed to provide decision-making guidance, and that is completely opposite of what my model is. And then they're also, they respond to decisions that have already been made, so it's a reaction to something that's already went wrong. So this essentially is the entire model that I created. So the objective of it is to provide guidance to the corporation on facilitating an ethical climate by focusing on influencing the character of the individual agents within the corporation and thus the behaviors of the individuals. And we're doing that through nurture, which will result in being ethical and facilitating that ethical climate, being efficient, and then caring for that relationship between corporations and their stakeholders. So the framework itself is focused on character, and essentially it will minimize harm and thus maximize benefit for all stakeholders collectively. You can't focus on just one particular stakeholder group. And then it does this through attacking where the corporation is most vulnerable, and is by understanding this process of how the individual works and how that changes the corporation and how the corporation works. So starting at the individual level, I'm starting with individuals because we are the people who run corporations. A corporation is not a live being. They cannot do anything for themselves. So we have three different levels. We have nature, we have behavior and decisions, and we have results. So our nature is our basic instincts, pretty much. It's those natural things that we're born with, don't really have control of. But naturally, we are self-interested, so we have that caring for others. And as people, we are goal-seeking. And so these are a list of core values that I created, and they're all related. And these are the things that we seek. And it is the path to eudaimonia, I can't even say it, which is the most final end, or most people compare it to happiness. But we have fairness, well-being, contentment, autonomy, and sustainability. And so it starts with fairness, and it works through. And so then that way, once you have it, then you can, have that happiness, so to speak. And so as people, we adapt to our environment, but adaptation requires that us be nurtured. And so once we have that nurture, we have our nature, then our character is determined in our behavior and our decisions. That's how we show ourselves. And so who we are determines the way that we're going to take to achieve some end. So, you could choose a bad route, you could choose a good route, but, there's always that end, and who we are determines which way we're going to get there. We have evaluative criteria. Sometimes we're like, okay, I'm gonna do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Other times it's like, well, I don't really care, I really want it, so I'm going to do that. And so these assessments are based on who we are, the end, and that expected value that we're going to receive. So then once you have that, then you have your results. So the results are either a positive or negative value that is attained from these decisions or behaviors, and it changes who we are. We learn from our experiences. And so that is how we change the community, and thus we change the corporate community. So now moving on to the corporation. It also has the same levels, but in an unnatural way. So we have the nature of the corporation, which is what type of business it is, what it does, and why. And then it's pretty much encompassing of what the corporation ought to be doing. And so the corporation pursues the core values like individuals do, but in an unnatural and thus different way. The core values are the final ends in itself instead of the eudaimonia. And the corporation is represented by agents since it is not a living being. And it consists of values, strategy, and implementation, which I will show you in the next slide. But it's the nature of the corporation where it's most vulnerable. And that is determined by management, what the nature of the corporation will be. The behaviors and decisions are the actual operations, it's what's actually happening. And so it reflects the internal behaviors and decisions of the internal stakeholders. So there are trade-offs that need to be made. You know, if you're relocating somewhere and you're going to bring more wages to that area, but say you're a factory that puts out more pollution, you're going to put out more pollution and thus be a detriment to the health of that local community. So it's like you have to make those trade-offs and decide what's in the best interest of both the corporation and the internal and external stakeholders. So the agents representing the corporation, they need to be prepared to be autonomous. They need to be able to be independent and make those decisions that they need to make. But at the end of it, we still have our results, so that's positive or negative value attained from decisions and behaviors. And that impacts stakeholder character, whether it be an internal stakeholder or an external stakeholder. I mean, if you're moving to an area and you're putting out those pollutions and somebody's about to die now because you just gave them all that unnecessary stuff, that's going to change who they are. And so, essentially, it affects the community as a whole. So this is where I move into providing my guidance. So basically, this is the nature of the corporation. So we have the values, that's step 1. And then we have the strategy, step 2. And then implementation, which is step 3. So basically, the values, they need to be explicitly stated. The strategy needs to be detailed, it needs to be clarified. It needs to be comprehension friendly. Generally, this strategic statements, they are made for the board to understand and for senior management to understand and nobody else. And it's not as detailed as it should be. And then they spend all this time, trying to come up with this awesome strategy and then forget, oh, now we have to implement it. Now what? So it needs to also describe how to implement it. It needs to include that code of ethics, but not as a marketing strategy as it's publicly available, but for accountability purposes. And then it should include the values, since the values is the foundation of the corporation. And then it needs to consider all the stakeholders, and then have a sustainable focus. And the sustainable focus is those core values, because having that focus where you're starting with your fairness, you're worried about those basic needs, moving on to a little bit more than that. I mean, that ultimately is the sustainability way to go. And then once you have your strategy good and ready, then we can implement it. So it needs to be a top-down approach because it is management that has those direct ties to all the different stakeholders. So there needs to be nurture from transformational leaders, which are those leaders who try to get people to share the vision, essentially. And so it needs to be led by example. It needs to be democratic, because people, if they don't feel involved, they tend to not care as much about what it is that they're doing. So it's sort of like that job versus career type thing. And then you need to have a workforce with parallel values. So if you have a workforce that has totally and completely different beliefs, they're not going to be dedicated to the firm like it should be. And then if you focus on maintaining a good reputation, then it sets parameters on how you are willing to act. and then, providing training, and then cross-functional roles where people can, be in different departments or be in different roles within a certain department so they can get an idea of the bigger picture and how they can make a difference. Because the more you know that you can make a difference, the more that you tend to care. So basically my model, there are benefits, there are limitations. So the benefits is it will improve efficiency because it will be better resource allocation, because then you could drop off some of those things that they're currently doing, like I showed in the first slide, where they're doing all these things that employees don't know about. And if you're focusing and preparing these people, to be ready to act the right way, then you don't need all those other things. And it will result in being ethical, obviously, or at least to the extent possible. And then it in part fulfills your CSR duties, and then provides basic guidance to the corporation, which a lot of models lack, and then, excuse me, also improve corporate social bonding. And then some of the limitations, though, are conflicting virtues, because as people, we have things that are inside of us. We're just like, should I do this or should I do that? So that's one of the big problems. And then being unaware of how you would impact a stakeholder, that's another problem. And then being unable to identify all the stakeholders that you could impact. And then regardless of what you do, there's always going to be a conflict of moral judgment amongst different cultures. So basically, my framework was designed to help the corporation influence the way people make their decisions within the corporation, and going to that extent to consider those external stakeholders. So it's like a focus for the corporation, but also for the people. So that was my references, that was my presentation. So